Hello and welcome to this session of the Bgcse History series. It is a discussion whose purpose is to share insights with history students at the Bgcse level, which is a syllabus taught in public senior secondary school in Botswana. In today's installment, I wish to explore in some detail the legal changes, which you may also refer to as reforms, which the British introduced once the Cape Colony was under their spell. We might not be able to exhaust the examples that are available, the examples of the changes of a legal nature which the British introduced upon taking over the reins in the Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1806. So let us jump straight into it. Our first example this evening will be the first legal change, not necessarily the first, but one of those standout, changes which were introduced by the British at the Cape, or within the Cape Colony in 1806, and this was none other than the Pass Ordinance, which also was known as the first Hottentot Code, introduced in 1809. Now, as the title suggests, it is a law which imposed restrictions on the non-whites, in particular the Kwekwe within the borders of the Cape Colony. These are people who were reduced to a life of vagrancy on account of them having been rendered or turned into a people that had no property because of the laws they were subjected to in terms of land ownership and even ownership of livestock such as cattle and sheep. Now, the Boer settlers were of the view that the Kwekwe made their life very difficult on account of them being vagrants who habitually broke into Dutch homes, who plundered Dutch homes, stole their property, and therefore, because the British were in charge at the Cape, it was therefore fitting that they address, the situation that Dutch settlers found themselves having to grapple with on account of the Kwekwe who were roaming all over the Cape Colony. Now, in response, the British introduced the Pass Ordinance in 1809, a legal change, you can call it even a law, whose intention was to control or to regulate the movement of the Kwekwe within the borders of the Cape Colony. Now, if you regulate movement, clearly you are saying there would be restrictions in terms of where the Kwekwe, could go, and if they were to go wherever they wanted to go, clearly they would be required to get, permission. And who would they be getting permission from? Such permission would be granted by the Boers or the Dutch on whose farms they worked as, servants, or on whose farms they were attached. Now, as per the pass ordinance, all Kwekwe residents within the confines of the Cape Colony were required as a matter of law to carry passes wherever they went. That is the first stipulation. That is the first characteristic of the pass ordinance. 2, they could also not leave the farm to which they were attached without the permission of their Boer master. And I want you to have this Boer master in quotations, because if all people are created, equally before the eyes of the Lord, then no one particular race should assume dominance over the other to the extent that they are referred to as that other race, are superiors. Now, in essence, the pass had to indicate the physical address, which in this particular instance would be the farm to which the Kwekwe was attached. And mind you, it is not a pass in the conventional sense of what a pass looks like, or a passport, but a metal necklace on which the details of the Boer master were actually inscribed. Now, over and above that, the law required the Kwekwe to have a permanent physical address. So those 3 would serve as our examples in terms of what the pass ordinance actually, stated or stipulated. Now, if you look at what the law actually stated, it is very clear that it was a piece of law whose primary purpose was to benefit the Dutch settlers or the Boer farmers. Because like I said when I started, it is them who had issues, who complained about the alleged vagrant activities or vagrancy which was displayed by the Kwekwe people resident within the confines or the borders of the Cape Colony. Now, quickly, if you were to look at the Kwekwe, it is not in doubt that used restrictions in terms of where they could go, when they could go. And mind you, anybody who breaks the law is expected to suffer certain consequences. And in this particular situation, in this particular instance, one of the grave consequences of flouting the stipulations of the 1809 pass ordinance was that you could be captured by any Boer farmer who on paper was expected to take you to the land roast, who in turn will decide which next Boer farm to attach you to. So that, boys and girls, my dear listener, was the effect that the law actually had on the Quaker. In summary, we are saying the Quaker were denied their freedom of movement because they could only leave the Cape. Say, for instance, if they wanted to visit a family member or a relative in one of the many districts within the borders of the Cape with the express permission of their master. So we cannot in any way argue that this piece of reform, this piece of legislation conferred any benefits to the Quaker. If anything, it is the Dutch plantation owners who benefited immensely because it was a sure way of granting them unlimited access to cheap labor, if not free labor in its entirety. Now, not satisfied with what the British did in 1809, the plantation owners, the Dutch plantation owners, the Boer farmers, if you allow me to call them such, also were not happy. And the source of their unhappiness was the fact that Quaker children who lived on their farms, on the Boer farms with their parents, had no responsibilities or even obligations towards the Boer master or the Dutch farmer. It was, in other words, the responsibility of the Boer farmer to feed these children up until perhaps they were old enough to be drafted into the life of bondage that their parents were subjected to. So to address the cries of the Boer farmers, the British in 1811 decided to introduce what was known as the Apprenticeship Act, which in some accounts is also known as the Second Hottentot Code. And like I said, this was introduced in 1811. Now, the purpose of the law was very clear. On paper, it was indicated that Quaker children from the age of 8 years had to work as apprentices on Boer farms for a period of 10 years. So in essence, what it means is a Quaker child from the age of 8 up until they were 18 years would become an apprentice on the Boer farm to which their parent was attached. So virtually, they became slaves, just like their parents. They became servants, just like their parents before them. So for a 10-year period, I beg your pardon, they were to be apprenticed to the very farms where their parents provided free, if not cheap labor to their Boer masters. Remember, this reform was intended to listen to the cries of the Boers who said they were incurring expenses because they had assumed the burden of feeding these Quaker children, who in turn had no responsibility whatsoever towards the Boers on whose farm they lived. Now, a quick one on the effect or even the impact of the reform on the Quaker. It is very clear, really, that this piece of legislation exposed Kwekwe children to enslavement from a very young age. And this life of bondage lasted for 10 years. Now, you might be wondering, after 10 years, what was to happen to them? Nothing really was to change, in practice at least, because they too would join the queue and become slaves like their parents before them. So there is no way really one could actually argue, convincingly we must add, that this piece of legislation conferred any benefits on the Kwekwe children. Rather, it was disadvantageous to them because it exposed them to slavery from a very young age. How about the Dutch farmers, the Boer settlers, the Boer farmers? Well, clearly they benefited because they got additional labor on their farms. With many hands on the farm, more certainly would be produced. And it is the Boer farmer who reaped the benefits at the end of the day, because they had no financial expenses that they incurred when it came to having to pay wages to these children. Remember, they are apprentices. They were to learn from their parents. Their parents, remember, were also not paid any dime for their toil. So as you read the literature, you would also get to appreciate that right, in particular, the Kwekwe. Well, I seem to be having network issues. My network is not that very stable. So it might affect the clarity of this live chat, live feed. But anyway, let's forge ahead. Now, there were some within the borders of the Cape Colony, especially, missionaries from the London Missionary Society, who were concerned with the status of the non-whites within the Cape Colony, where the laws treated citizens equally. And they were very influential people. They even had lobby groups, support groups, if you wish, people who supported them within the British Parliament, the House of Commons. So they exerted pressure on the British government at the Cape to address the plight of the non-whites, especially the Quaker within the Cape Colony. And that is why in 1811, 1812, we see the introduction of the circuit courts, which touring, the districts of the Cape to listen to whatever cases were referred to them by the Quaker. The Boers, on the other hand, characterized or described them or even referred to them rather as the black circuits. Now, there immediately you would pause and wonder, why black circuits? So clearly, the Boers of the view, however right it was, that the circuit courts favored blacks over them. And remember, I said when I started my little, chat with you on the circuit courts that it is a law which was intended to promote equality before the law. In other words, all citizens of the Cape, regardless of their race, were equal before the eyes of the law. So they were to enjoy the same legal possibilities, legal opportunities, legal rights. So they were to be treated equally. So With regard to this particular law, that is the stipulations, one of the things that it put out very clearly was that the Kwekwe were now given the liberty, the freedom, the right to report their abusive masters to a court of law. They could take up such a case of abuse with a magistrate. And the common examples of abuse they suffered at the hands of the Boers would include, among others, refusal to pay them wages if they were working for a wage, or even physical abuse, people getting beaten up for no good reason whatsoever. And we must quickly add that with the help of the missionaries, quite a good number of abusive Boer masters were taken before the magistrate to answer for cases of abuse that they subjected to their servants. And some were convicted of their crimes. And the penalty in most of the instances, if not all instances, was a fine. So if the Kwekwe could take their masters to court, that riled the Boers. It angered the Boers because they were a people who were used to be treated with rubber gloves, rubber gloves, I beg your pardon. It is people who were pampered by the system. They were so used to be beneficiaries of the system in all senses of the word. In fact, being placed on an equal footing with their with their Kwekwe servants, to them was akin. It was the same as, similar to, a heresy. It was heretical in their eyes that they could be taken to a court of law by their servants. It was against God's law. However, despite their religious bias or convictions, if you wish, strong beliefs, the law is the law. It had to be applied. Now, perhaps before we look at how the Kwekwe could have benefited from this particular law, it is important to point, by way of an example, the extent to which Boer hatred towards this particular piece of law was deep-seated, deep-rooted. It is a law which contributed directly to what came to be known as the Slagtersnek incident of 1815, which, if I may describe it briefly, is an incident or a story about a frontier Boer by the name of Frederick Bgcse, a frontier Boer. It's Boers who lived on the peripheries of the borders of the Cape Colony, far away from the city, rural Boers basically. Now, Frederick Bgcse was an abusive Boer master who was given to abusing his Kwekwe servants. So following the introduction of the 1811 circuit courts, one of his servants actually reported him to the circuit courts. And in 1813, he was summoned. He was ordered to appear before a court of law, before a magistrate, to answer to those charges. And he refused, up until 1815, when the British decided to send British soldiers who were assisted by a group of Kwekwe police officers to go and arrest this man. Now, upon arrival in the village of Slagtersnek, Bgcse, we are told, shot at the police officers who were sent to arrest him. And in exchange of fire, he was shot and killed. His supporters, on the other hand, decided to stage a rebellion an uprising against what they termed a heavy-handed manner in as far as how the British dealt with the issue was concerned. Now, the rebels, 6 of them, were arrested. These would be the ringleaders. And 5 of them were sentenced to death. Only 1 of them escaped the hangman. And this should not surprise us that the Boers reacted with shock at what happened to the rebels, how they were treated by the British, because they had not expected the punishment to be as severe as it was. Now, here is what is important to note in the context of how the Slachtosnik incident of 1815 could have affected the relations between the Boers and the British. One obvious effect was that it intensified Boer hatred towards the British. 2, it also directly contributed to what later came to be known as the Boer Trek, especially after 1835, where Boers decided to pack up their personal belongings and head into the interior of Southern Africa to be as far away as it was humanly possible from British control. So that is the story of the Slachtosnik. And remember, you must understand it in the context of the Circuit Courts of 1811, and also in the context of Boer opposition to this piece of legislation which the British introduced. Did the Khakwe benefit from this particular law? Of course, they benefited, because Boers feared and even hated the fact that if they were to abuse their servants, they would not be spared the embarrassment of being taken to a court of law by their servants. So to them, that was extremely embarrassing. So in other words, it reduced incidents or cases of abuse that the Khakwe would suffer at the hands of their Boer masters. There is also this other interesting piece of information that I would want to share with you, still on the same matter, issue of the Circuit Courts. Now, mind you, some of the Khakwe were literate. They knew how to read and write. They spoke fluent English because they lived in missionary centers where they were exposed to Western education, thanks to the missionaries. And when these frontier Boers, these illiterate, farmers, Boer farmers, were arraigned before a court of law, they had to rely on the translation service that was actually offered or provided by their former servants. To them, that was very embarrassing. Not every Boer person could speak, let alone understand the English language. So they had to rely on a people which they considered an inferior people compared to them. So sometimes it was better for them not to ill-treat their Khakwe servants, because if you do not ill-treat them, you won't be taken to a court of law where you'll have to suffer the embarrassment of having a former servant translating for you. So if you look at it, it is a law which benefited the Khakwe, because out of fear, Boer masters decided to relent in terms of the type of treatment that they meted out to their Khakwe servants. Let's move on. Not entirely happy with the conditions of the Khakwe or non-whites in general within the Cape Colony. The London Missionary Society under Dr. John Philip exerted even more pressure on the British to do more to improve the plight of the lowly non-white person in the Kwekwe, non-white position, the lowly position of the non-white people within the borders of the Cape Colony. And this saw the introduction of the 50th Ordinance in 1828, which one author has characterized as the freeing of labor. Now, this is yet another piece of law which promoted equality before the law for all residents or inhabitants of the Cape Colony. Now, how does the law promote equality? It promotes equality in several ways. One, it repealed, in other words, it cancelled the 1809 Pass Ordinance and the 1811 Apprenticeship Act. The Kwekwe, in other words, were no longer required to carry a pass wherever they went. Two, the Kwekwe could now work for a wage. And three, the Kwekwe could own land, a right they were denied by the Boers. And it is a right that they never got to enjoy up until probably after the introduction of this statute in 1828. So that is, in a nutshell, what the law was about. Did the Dutch settlers or the Boer farmers accept it? Is a resounding no, they did not. It takes us back to their religious convictions, their strong religious beliefs, that non-whites were descendants of Ham, whose permanent station in life was to provide servile labor to the descendants of Shem, who were white people. So their view, was still that it was a heresy for them to be placed on an equal footing with people who were given to them by God to serve them, to be their slaves, to be their servants, to be their eternal servants, you might want to add. However, on the other side of the coin, the Kwekwe benefited in the sense that they could now work for a wage. And quite clearly, if they earned a wage for the work they performed on Boer farms, in all probability, some of them would save their little wages and pay school fees for their children, or even use those little wages to support their families. Second, and quite obvious, it is a piece of law which released them from a life of bondage. They were no longer anybody's servants or chattels, mere property or slaves. Because like I said earlier, the law repealed both the 1809 Pass Ordinance as well as the 1811 Apprenticeship Act. Let's look into the last two examples. The other one, or maybe the last example, would be the abolition of slavery or the Emancipation Act of 1833. It is a piece of law which stated in very unambiguous terms that slavery should come to an end within the Cape Colony. No slaves were to be imported into the Cape Colony. The already existing slaves were to serve as apprentices for a certain period of time, after which they were to be granted their freedom. So it is a law which restored the dignity of the non-whites, in particular the Kwekwe, within the borders of the Cape Colony. Now, Boers, as it was to be expected, were up in arms. They were against this particular piece of law. And you'd understand their vehement, strong opposition, because clearly if the Kwekwe were no longer to work on their farms free of charge, that would affect output, agricultural output, because their farming enterprises were dependent on the free labor which was provided by the Kwekwe. Now, if these men and women were to become free men and women, then for them to continue to have access to Kwekwe labor, they had to foot the bill. They had to pay. So to them, the law was intended to deny them a God-given right, privilege, to treat the Kwekwe anyhow. I would encourage you to read more on these reforms so that you can get to deepen your understanding of this content. There is content which is very important, as the topic is very popular with examinations. Yeah, that is, people who set examinations. And in the comments section, you might even pose further questions if you need me to clarify any one of the reforms, the legal changes which I have thus far discussed. Now, a quick one. Now, this fits into the next topic under, still within the Bgcse history segment, the Boer trek. That you must note, the very British reforms that rubbed Boer farmers the wrong way, the very legal changes which the Boers did not find acceptable, directly contributed to the Boer trek, which, like I said, would be the next topic that we venture into. That is before we exhaust. That is after we, beg your pardon, have exhausted our discussions on the administrative changes, which would make the bulk of our discussions in the next installment in this series of lessons. If you have questions, don't shy away from posing those questions through the comments section beneath the video. And do also like the page, share it with your friends, tag your friends. That, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of our discussion. And remember, there are no alternative facts.